When I was a kid, I was living with my grandma in an apartment complex in a very poor area. It was a really bad neighborhood, but my granny and I were living in the nicer part. The apartment complex was pretty small, with 3 floors and 12 apartments all in all. But as the neighborhood wasn't exactly friendly, neither were the neighbors. We hardly knew anyone in the complex. People were constantly moving in and out before you even had a chance to say hello. But then again, the few people we did say hello to were either creeps or criminals. I don't think we were missing out on anything. The complex had a huge basement, and each apartment had its own room in the basement. The basement also held a laundry. The entire basement was creepy as heck. It was really quiet down there, and you could pretty much hear a pin drop. Anything going on in the complex would manifest into sounds in the basement. On top of that, the heater, which was down there too, was always making sounds like a dying cat, and every pipe and floorboard was creaky like they were paid to do it. As a young child, my granny didn't allow me to go down there on my own. Even before this particular incident, plenty of bad stuff had happened down there. People would often use the basement room for illegal activities or store bad stuff down there. A lot of people would move away without cleaning out their rooms too, leaving behind stuff to be found by the landlord. One time the landlord found a meth lab. Another time, he found a batch of dead dogs, which had apparently been alive when the resident of the room had been living in the complex, but had starved to death once he had moved out. Anyway, I was 14 when I was first allowed down in the basement on my own. My grandma was getting old, and I was taking over more and more responsibilities at home. Doing the laundry was always my biggest horror, because that was when I had to go down in the basement. Yet as time went by, and I got more used to the sounds and creaks down there, the basement was just a tiny bit less creepy. When I was 15, my grandma won a new dining table set in a rally. Being the old-fashioned hoarder she was, she didn't want to part with her old set and instead wanted it down in our basement room, which of course was on my shoulders. I went down into our basement with a few chairs, then into our room. That is when I first heard the noise. The reason I noticed it was that it was unlike any of the noises I usually heard down there. It was repetitive and pattern-like, not like every other noise, which seemed random. The noise was strong in our room, but not outside of it, like someone was knocking on the walls in the room next to ours. I put my ears to the wall, trying to figure out where the noise was coming from. I remember thinking that perhaps it was rats or other pests running around in the walls. Then the pattern became even more obvious. 3 short knocks, 3 long knocks, 3 short knocks. I immediately had a feeling I had heard the pattern before, but couldn't quite put my finger on why. I went back up to my grandma and asked her about it. She reminded me it was the Morse code for SOS, which she had taught me long ago. I told her I had heard it down in the basement, and she went down there with me to investigate. When she heard it too, she called the police. Well, the police showed up with the landlord, then had each resident open their basement room. The resident who wasn't home or was otherwise unavailable had their rooms knocked open with a ram. In one room, the police found a big old-fashioned closet. Inside, they found a young woman who had been abused, starved, and pretty much tortured. The owner of the room was an elderly man who was living in the apartment on top of ours. As it turns out, she had been down there for at least 5 days, and while a lot of other people had apparently heard the noise, no one else had recognized it as the SOS signal. This happened when I was 5 or 6. My mom and dad were at work, so my 8-year-old brother and sister were watching me. We would always go down to the basement to play because it was really creepy, and they enjoyed it, even though I despised it due to its sheer creepiness. Every time I would go down there, I would always stay with my older siblings because in my eyes, they were so cool and awesome. Anyway, we had finished playing and were ready to go upstairs and play the rocket power game on our GameCube when they ran ahead of me. The basement was always very dark and creepy. It was huge, and in the dead center were the stairs that led to the first floor, and right down the stairs was one of those small windows that showed the top of the grass. Well, my brother and sister ran ahead of me and locked the door before I could get out. As soon as it was shut, I could hear them laughing and saying stuff like, "Ha, we got you," and "You're trapped down there forever with all the ghosts that like to eat little kids." They thought it was just hilarious. And because we were home alone, they could do this and not worry about getting in trouble. Anyway, as I'm banging on the door, sobbing, begging them to let me out, I look back and see a man crouched down, just staring at me from outside the window. His expression was completely blank. His eyes were wide and bloodshot. He had a ton of scars and cuts on his face, and he was incredibly thin, with long black greasy hair. This only scared me more. I started screaming that there was a man at the window, but my brother and sister only laughed harder. We had one of those metal plates that you stick to the bottom of the door to keep your dog from scratching it. Well, my dog had scratched part of the metal down. As I'm banging on the door, I cut my knee open. I start screaming more, and then I turn back to see if the man was still there. He was. He looked at me, then at my profusely bleeding knee, then back at me. Then he just started laughing insanely. It was probably the most sick laugh I had ever heard, and once he opened his mouth, I could see he barely had any teeth whatsoever. His laugh was so sickening, it sent chills down my spine, and I don't think there's even a way possible to explain this man's sound. I started screaming louder for them to go lock the door, but they only laughed louder. I could hear his laugh over my own screaming and my brother and sister's. Eventually, they opened the door and saw that I was bleeding and pulled the good old "don't tell Dad," which we later on had to. I laid down on the ground, right outside the basement door. The window was still visible. The man watched for a second longer, with the same apathetic, cold, lifeless stare as before, then stood up and literally skipped away. I never saw him again, nor were there any reports in our neighborhood. I tried telling my family about this, but no one believed me. I did get something cool out of it, though. My knee ended up scarring, and often when I meet new people and they ask where it came from, I always get the pleasure of saying, "Well, you see, I used to be an adventurer, but then I took an arrow in the knee." It's a great way to get girls. When I was 13, my best friend Lisa lived in a very rural, woodsy area. There wasn't a lot to do, but it was a blast to explore in the fall. Maybe about a 15-minute walk away, which was much shorter by golf cart, our primary means of travel before we could drive, was this old, rotting house that had been uninhabited since before either of us were born. My friend's mom knew the guy who used to live there, just an elderly man who passed away either by a heart attack or old age or something, completely not spooky. But the house was run down and filled with holes and had broken windows and a spooky basement and was never completely emptied out, so it was fun for us 13-year-olds to get into and explore. We would tell scary stories and try to find ghosts or whatever. So one day around Halloween, we took the golf cart and drove down to the house to do some exploring and creep ourselves out. We turned down the long driveway to the house and parked off to the side of the house, on the off chance if anyone came down the driveway, they wouldn't see that we were there. We were trying to get all of our gear together. We'd often bring backpacks and cameras with us when we went exploring, when Lisa suddenly just stopped talking. I looked up to see what she was doing and realized she was staring at a guy standing in the doorway watching us. He looked maybe 5 or so years older than we were, pretty normal looking, but he was smiling. It's not like we had never seen other people at the house, the occasional other groups of teens rummaging through things. But this was the first time I remember feeling so uncomfortable. When he had both of our attention, he just calls out, "There's a party in the basement. It's $5 to get in." I was like, what the fuck? There were no cars around, no kids lingering outside, no noise, no indication that anyone else was there but us. Also, the basement was dark and trashed and smelled terrible. I had been in there before, and there was absolutely no way a party would be fun or even feasible. Lisa said something along the lines of, "That's fine, we were just leaving." And the guy responded, "I was just kidding. It's free to get in. How old are you guys?" I have no idea why, but Lisa got out of the cart and started walking toward the door. I was like, fuck that. I'm good right here. She looked like she was trying to see inside the door without getting too close, but he was leaning in the doorway. I was still sitting in the cart, like, "Lisa, hey, let's go. I'm super hungry, blah blah blah, excuses to leave. Please get the hint." But they were both ignoring me. Then I noticed someone in the window, which was directly in front of the cart, not even trying to be discreet, with their finger to their lips, like they were telling me to be quiet. Then the guy in the window, or girl, but I think it was a guy, starts dancing, I think. He was swaying and chomping his teeth, and it was the most unnerving thing I've seen to this day. So I yelled, "Lisa, I have to pee. We need to go or I'm leaving because I have to pee." And I guess she sensed my urgency because she stops talking to the guy in the door, who was honestly just making casual conversation at this point, and walks back to the cart. She tells the guy we'll be back in 15 minutes, and he waved goodbye. Window person, by the way, stopped dancing when Lisa walked back to the cart and was now looking towards the door at his friend. I am happy to say that we arrived home safely, but I freely admit that I was crying my eyes out trying to explain what I saw. I told her that I was never, ever, ever going back to that house again. More than likely, just two guys who were high and trying to scare some 13-year-old girls. But even so, you should not try to lure children into an abandoned house.